I've spent the better part of my life in the woods, 40 years to be exact. From the eastern to the central US, I've hiked, camped, and backpacked in places most people only see in pictures. The Allegheny National Forest has been a constant in my journey, a patch of wilderness so thick and untamed, it feels like the world's edge. I've walked its winding trails countless times, the scent of pine and wet earth always fresh in the air. I've been far enough off trail that my boots didn't even leave prints, but I knew the land and it knew me. That day, the wind was calm, the sun a dull orange as it dipped behind the ridge. My friends and I had set up camp in a secluded spot, far from the noise of people. It was a usual routine for us. We unpacked our gear, set up our tents, and gathered wood for the fire. The forest, thick with trees, was as still as it ever was, and the silence was comforting. I was in my mid-50s, still spry, though the years were starting to show in the creak of my knees. But in the woods, I felt ageless. I'm not the type to jump at every rustle in the bushes or every snap of a branch. Over the years, I've learned that most creatures in the forest want nothing more than to leave you alone. Even the bears, yes, I've seen plenty of them from a safe distance, had always been a minor nuisance, not a threat. They avoid you, you avoid them. Simple as that. That evening, after a long day of hiking through the dense brush, I went off to find a spot for my hammock. I had one of those lightweight setups, just enough to hang between two sturdy trees. I was a little out of sight from the main camp, just the way I liked it, where I could relax and take in the quiet of the woods. I didn't notice the bees at first. They were just a hum in the background, like the usual drone of insects in late summer. My mistake was getting too close to their nest. I had to have brushed past it unknowingly. The pain hit suddenly, sharp stings that shot through my arm, my neck, my leg, a dozen of them. I swatted at the air, trying to make sense of what was happening as my skin burned from the venom. My first thought was to head back to the fire, but a tightening in my chest stopped me in my tracks. I'd been stung before, bees, wasps, hornets, but I had a slight allergy to their venom. Nothing too severe, but enough that it usually caused swelling, some discomfort. I didn't carry an EpiPen anymore. I told myself it wasn't necessary. Just a precaution I didn't need to worry about. I've been fine all these years. This time, though, I started to feel different. The tightness in my chest wasn't just from the stings. My breath was shallow, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I staggered back to the hammock, collapsing into the nylon seat.
Y figúrate de bait.
There was nothing else to do. I couldn't get to the car in time. It wasn't like there was an easy way to get help out here. The nearest ranger station was hours away. I was alone, and it was just me and the woods now. I tried to control my breathing. Slow, steady inhales, then out. The air felt thick in my lungs, but I wasn't gasping for breath yet. My vision started to blur at the edges, and my hands trembled slightly. I felt like I was sinking into the earth, as though the forest was closing in on me. The bees, which had been a nuisance just a few minutes ago, now felt like a distant memory. My own body the real threat. I lay back, staring up at the trees above, the leaves casting patterns on the sky. My thoughts were all over the place. Regret, fear, a strange calmness. The world outside the hammock seemed far away, like I was slipping into another realm where nothing could touch me. The sting was still there, but it was the suffocation of breath that worried me most. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The tightness in my chest didn't worsen, but it didn't let up either. Every breath was laborious, like the air was just out of reach. I tried to remember the times I'd heard about people getting stung by bees, how some just didn't make it. The idea that this could be it, this could be the one time I didn't make it out of the woods, was almost laughable. After all the years of camping, of seeing bears, snakes, even a bobcat once, it wasn't a bear that was going to do me in. It was a damn bee, I reached into my pack and grabbed my water bottle, trying to take a drink, but the bottle felt heavy in my hand, like it belonged to someone else. My breath still came in shallow gasps, but the panic began to fade. My heart wasn't pounding in my chest anymore, just a steady thrum that reminded me I was still alive. Then something changed. It wasn't immediate, but over time, I began to feel the tightness in my chest loosen, just a bit. The burning pain from the stings didn't feel as sharp anymore either. I forced myself to sit up, leaning against a tree. The sky was turning purple, the light slowly draining from the day. I had made it through the worst of it. I don't know how long I stayed there trying to get my bearings back. The night was coming on, and I needed to get back to camp before the darkness made it impossible to navigate. The air was still, the sound of the night creeping in. I gathered my things as best as I could, still feeling off, but not enough to worry about collapse. The walk back to camp was slow. I didn't rush and I didn't panic. I knew I had survived. The worst was behind me. The hammock, the bee stings, the breathing. Everything felt distant now. I reached the fire pit where my friends had started a fire. The warmth from the flames was like a breath of life, and I sat down beside it, letting the heat calm the remnants of the panic. I kept thinking about the woods, the way they had always been so full of life, yet so unforgiving. The bears I'd seen, the bobcats, even a couple of wolves once. But it wasn't any of them that had gotten me. It was the bees. It was always something I couldn't control, something I didn't see coming. The night settled in, and I watched the fire crackle, the flames flickering. The woods outside were as silent as ever, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt a strange peace, the kind that only comes after surviving something close. But even in the comfort of the firelight, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods had reminded me just how fragile life was. It wasn't the bears. It wasn't the snakes or the wild animals that I had to fear the most. It was the little things, the things I couldn't see, couldn't anticipate. And in the end, it wasn't the wilderness that scared me. It was the knowledge that no matter how long I spent in these woods, there were always things beyond my control, things I could never predict. I've been back to that same spot in the Allegheny forest many times since, but the bees stay with me, the memory of that suffocating moment, the reminder that the forest doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care how many times you've been out there, how many miles you've hiked. It only cares about survival. And sometimes you get lucky, but sometimes the bees don't let you go. Taking the family camping last October seemed like the perfect way to kick off fall. I was looking forward to a weekend of crisp air, quiet nights under the stars, and a few days away from the hustle of everyday life. We picked out a spot in the woods, just outside of a small town in northern New York, an area known for its quiet, off-the-beaten-path campsites. The plan was simple. Get there early on Friday, set up camp, and enjoy some time together. But, as it often happens, things didn't go exactly as planned. We arrived at the campsite around 8 a.m. on Friday. The kids, Olivia and Noah, were excited to be out of the car after the long drive. My wife, Sarah, and I unpacked the car while the kids explored the campsite. It was cold, but not unbearable. The kind of chill that makes the air feel fresh, but still bearable if you were layered up. We had a beautiful spot by a stream with a clear view of the dense forest surrounding us. I could already picture us by the fire later, the warmth of the flames a perfect contrast to the crisp fall air. The first day went great. We made lunch by the campfire, roasted hot dogs, and took the kids on a short hike through the woods. Noah, at 8 years old, was a little hesitant at first but warmed up to the idea quickly. Olivia, at 6, was already sprinting ahead, always ready to explore. Sarah and I were happy to see the kids having fun, letting go of the stress of school and work. We set up our tents later that afternoon and decided to make a simple dinner of grilled chicken and vegetables. The sun set early, around 6 p.m., casting the forest in that golden autumn glow that made everything seem peaceful. We all went to bed around 8:30, with Olivia and Noah already nodding off in their sleeping bags inside the tent, Sarah and I lying on our air mattresses. It wasn't until around 3 a.m. that things started to go wrong. I woke up to a sound I couldn't immediately place, something like a choking noise. I turned to Sarah, who was still asleep, and quietly got out of the tent. My daughter, Olivia, had thrown up in her sleep. There was no mistaking the smell, thick and sour, hanging in the cold air. She was curled up, breathing heavily, but it looked like she hadn't woken up through the mess. My heart dropped when I saw the pile of vomit beside her sleeping bag. I quickly grabbed a blanket, tossed it over the mess, and tried to stay calm. It wasn't the worst thing to happen on a camping trip, but I felt a pang of frustration. We had just gotten here, and now I was dealing with a sick kid in the middle of the night. But I didn't wake Sarah. I didn't want to disturb her when it seemed like Olivia was still asleep. I decided to deal with it later when it was light out. After all, it was already freezing outside, and we weren't exactly in the best spot to clean things up properly in the dark. So I tucked her in tighter, hoping she'd sleep through the rest of the night. Unfortunately, it wasn't over. Around 5 a.m., I woke again to the sounds of my son, Noah, coughing in his sleep. I shot up and turned to him. The first thing I noticed was that he had vomited as well. Unlike Olivia, he was wide awake, and he had gotten most of it on himself. His pajamas were soaked, his hair matted against his forehead. The smell was overwhelming, and in the half-light of the tent, I could see his face contorted with discomfort. My frustration grew. The kids had picked up a stomach bug from daycare before we left, but we hadn't realized how badly it would hit them. I couldn't help but feel a little resentful, but I pushed those feelings aside. This was a situation that needed action, and fast. At this point, Sarah woke up and immediately started gathering things to clean Noah up, but it was clear the situation was too much for us to handle in the middle of the night. I knew the best course of action was to load the kids up and drive home as quickly as possible. It was the right call. We weren't prepared for this, and the cold was only making things worse. By 5:30 a.m., Sarah had packed up the car. I helped as best as I could, but it was clear the kids needed rest, and it wasn't going to happen out in the woods in freezing temperatures. I kissed them goodbye, and Sarah took off down the road, the headlights fading into the distance as I stood there alone. I stood in the campsite trying to shake off the feeling of failure. It was my fault. I had wanted this camping trip. I had thought it would be the perfect way for us to unwind, and now I was left with the cleanup all by myself. The tent, the campsite, the fire pit, the dirty sleeping bags. It all had to go. As Sarah drove off, the cold hit me even harder. The air was now closer to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the frost on the ground crunched beneath my boots as I went to work. I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. I knew I couldn't just leave the mess and drive away. That wasn't the kind of person I was. So I got to work. I started with the tent. It was the easiest thing to take down. The poles slipped together easily enough and I rolled it up, but it still felt like a task that would take forever. I tried to make the best of it. I found a small, makeshift bag for the dirty sleeping bags and stuffed them inside, but the smell of vomit was still thick in the air, making my stomach churn. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being punished for thinking this trip would be easy. It took me nearly 3 hours to pack everything up, step by step, trying to make sure nothing was left behind. The campground was quiet as it should be. Not another soul in sight. The forest around me was still, the only sound being the rustle of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. It was peaceful, but I couldn't enjoy it. I kept thinking about my wife and kids heading home. They were likely already an hour down the road, and I was still here alone taking down camp. By the time the sun started to rise fully, I had everything packed into the car. The campsite was completely empty, all traces of us gone. I took one last look around the quiet, empty woods. There was no sound but the birds waking up in the trees. It felt surreal, like I was in a movie, and I was the only character left. I finally drove away, leaving the campsite behind. I couldn't help but feel relieved that it was over, but I also knew that the memory of this trip wouldn't fade easily. We'd never get back the time we'd planned to have, but at least we would be home where the kids could rest. As I drove away, my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see Sarah's car. It wasn't there, of course. It had been gone for a while, and that's when I realized this trip, as messed up as it was, would stick with me. But the important thing was that we made it through, even if it wasn't how I imagined. By the time I reached home, Sarah had already started getting the kids settled. Noah was asleep in the back seat, and Olivia was lying across the couch, dozing off. The house was quiet, and I felt a sense of finality wash over me. We were home. The mess was gone, and despite the ruined camping trip, we had all made it through the night. I couldn't help but smile. Even though it didn't go as planned, we were okay. It might not have been the camping trip I'd envisioned, but it was a reminder that sometimes things don't go perfectly, and that's okay. As I sat down on the couch, finally able to relax, I knew I'd always remember that camping trip in the woods, just not for the reasons I thought I would. In the summer of 1997, my family decided to take a trip to a place my parents had been telling us about for years, Big Sur, California. I was about 7 or 8 at the time, full of energy and excitement, ready for an adventure. We packed up the old station wagon and headed out on the long drive, leaving behind the bustle of city life for the peaceful, winding roads of the coast. My brother, who was a few years older than me, and I spent most of the time in the back seat, playing games and teasing each other. My parents drove in silence, content to let us entertain ourselves. We camped for a few nights near a secluded spot by the river. The campsite was surrounded by towering trees, their leaves whispering in the wind like some ancient language. The sound of the river was constant, a gentle murmur that made everything feel alive, like we were part of something much bigger than ourselves. The air was crisp, fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The ground beneath our feet was soft, a thick carpet of needles and moss. It was the perfect place to escape, to disconnect. On the first full day of our trip, we decided to swim in the river. It was early afternoon, the sun hanging high in the sky, warming the air just enough to make the cool water feel like a refreshing relief. The river was wide, shallow in some places, deep in others. The current was gentle, but strong enough to pull you along if you weren't careful. We spent hours splashing around, laughing and enjoying the summer heat. My brother tried to show off by jumping off rocks, landing with big splashes, while I floated on my back, letting the water carry me. I remember it was when I was lying on a large flat rock near the edge of the river that I felt it. A sharp, sudden pain in my left ear. At first, I thought I had just bumped it on something, but then the pain hit again, sharper and more intense. I slapped my hand to my ear, and when I pulled it away, I saw a bee stuck to my skin. The sting sent waves of pain through my ear, a deep, throbbing ache that felt like it was spreading through my head. I yelped and rushed to the shore, rubbing my ear in a panic. The swelling came fast, my ear ballooning up almost immediately. It was a strange sight, my ear distorting, growing larger and redder with each passing second. I remember thinking it looked like something out of a cartoon, but it hurt so much I couldn't even laugh at the thought. My parents came over quickly, but there wasn't much they could do. We didn't have any of the usual remedies for bee stings. No baking soda or anything to neutralize the venom. They tried to comfort me, but nothing helped. The pain was so bad I couldn't focus on anything else. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a haze, my ear feeling like it was on fire. My brother teased me a bit, but I was too miserable to care. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear one by one, I found myself lying in the tent, wide awake. The buzzing in my head was overwhelming. It wasn't just the echo of the pain in my ear. It was as if every little fly and insect in the area was drawn to me, to my swollen, painful ear. I could hear them buzzing outside the tent, circling in the dark. The sound was constant, like an invasion. I hated it. The more I heard, the more I wanted to rip off my ear, to do anything to make the buzzing stop. The night felt longer than it should have. My brother was already asleep, his rhythmic breathing filling the silence between us. My parents were talking quietly outside, but I couldn't concentrate on their voices. All I could hear was the buzzing. I twisted and turned in my sleeping bag, unable to get comfortable. Every time I closed my eyes, the buzzing seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I spent what felt like hours just staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, the faint outlines of tree branches swaying in the wind above me. The air inside the tent was warm, thick with the smell of sweat and the faint trace of campfire smoke. The discomfort in my ear made everything seem worse. It was as if the pain had somehow attached itself to everything, coloring the world in an unbearable way. Eventually, I drifted into a fitful sleep, the buzzing never truly leaving my ears. But when I woke up the next morning, something was different. The pain in my ear had lessened, though it was still swollen and sensitive. I could almost hear properly again, though it felt muffled, like I had water in my ear. The first rays of the morning sun were creeping through the trees, casting soft shadows on the ground. That day, we decided to go for a short hike. My parents thought it would help me take my mind off the bee sting, and the idea of getting away from the buzzing insects was enough to make me agree. We packed a small lunch and set off into the forest, following a narrow trail that wound through thick underbrush. The trees here were even taller than near the river, their trunks so wide it took both of us to wrap our arms around them. The air was different here, cooler, with the smell of damp earth and the rich scent of pine needles. I wasn't really paying attention to the trail at first. My mind was still on my ear, still angry at the bees, still irritated by the buzz of insects. But as we walked further into the woods, something about the place began to settle my nerves. The air seemed cleaner, the sounds of the river and the insects fading into the background. The forest was alive with movement, squirrels darting in and out of trees, birds calling overhead, the occasional rustle of leaves. There was something about the forest that made me feel small, but in a good way, like I was a part of it, not separate from it. We stopped for lunch near a small clearing, where the sunlight filtered down through the leaves in golden beams. My brother and I sat on a rock, eating our sandwiches and looking around. The world felt quieter here, more peaceful. There was still a slight buzzing in my ear, but it was easier to ignore now that I wasn't near the river. The only noise now was the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. After lunch, we packed up and began to head back to the campsite. I felt better, though I was still aware of the swelling in my ear. We hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and the peacefulness of the hike had helped me calm down. It wasn't until we were near the campsite again that something made me stop. It was just a feeling at first, something small in the back of my mind that told me something wasn't quite right. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but an odd sensation, like being watched. I glanced around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The trees were just trees, the bushes just bushes. But the buzzing came again, louder now, echoing in my head. And for the first time, I realized the buzzing wasn't just in my head. Something was in the air around us, something strange. I froze, staring into the trees. It wasn't a typical summer buzz, the sort of light sound that came with warm weather. It was deeper, heavier, almost mechanical. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on us. My heart began to race. I took a few steps forward, trying to shake the feeling, but it only got stronger. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow flitting just beyond the trees, too quick for me to make out. My pulse quickened, and I wanted to call out, but the words caught in my throat. The buzzing had grown louder, and now it sounded like it was all around us. Too many insects, too many wings flapping in the air. I turned to my parents and my brother, but they hadn't noticed. They were still talking, oblivious to the growing tension in the air. I took another step, then another, my eyes scanning the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something I couldn't see but was definitely aware of us. I started to back away, a deep unease taking over my body, and as I did, I heard it. A sudden rustling in the bushes, something heavy moving through the underbrush. That was when I knew. Whatever it wasn't a creature of the forest. It wasn't natural. It wasn't a bee or a bird or anything that should be here. My heart was pounding now, and my body felt like it was being pulled in two directions: stay or run. Without thinking, I grabbed my brother's arm and yanked him toward the campsite. I didn't care about anything else. I didn't care about the pain in my ear or the fact that I was still too young to understand what was happening. All I knew was that we had to leave. We didn't stop until we were back at the campsite, and even then, we didn't feel safe. I never told anyone what I thought I saw, what I thought was out there in the trees. Maybe I was just too shaken, or maybe I was too young to understand what I had really felt. But whatever it was, it stayed with me. Every time I hear the buzz of a bee now, every time I'm near the edge of a forest, I remember that feeling. The quiet terror of knowing that sometimes the world isn't as simple as I wanted some quiet time away from everything, so I decided to camp in the mountains with just my dog, Scout. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, but things started going wrong right away. The rain came earlier than I thought, and the trail quickly turned into a muddy mess. By the time I found a flat spot to set up my tent, it was pouring so hard I was soaked through. The forest around me felt heavy, the trees tall and thick, blocking out what little light was left. Everything smelled wet, like the ground was soaking in all the rain. Scout seemed nervous from the start. He kept sniffing the air, his ears twitching at every little sound. I tried to brush it off, thinking the storm was just spooking him. I pitched the tent as fast as I could, crawled inside, and dried Scout off with an old towel. I gave him some food and tried to settle in for the night. The rain pounded on the tent, loud enough to almost cover up the occasional cracking of branches and rustling in the forest. It was around midnight when Scout's behavior changed. He shot up from where he was lying, his body tense, his ears straight up. He stared at the tent door and let out a low, deep growl. I'd never heard him make a sound like that before. It made my skin crawl. I froze, trying to listen, but all I could hear was the rain. Then, under the noise of the storm, I heard it, crunching, slow steps on the wet ground moving closer. My first thought was a bear, but the steps were too steady, too careful. Bears don't move like that. My heart started racing as I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a little. I shone the light outside, the beam cutting through the rain. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But Scout wouldn't stop growling, his eyes fixed on the same spot outside the tent. The footsteps stopped, and the forest felt off. It wasn't just quiet. It was wrong, like everything was holding its breath. I zipped the tent back up and grabbed the knife I always bring camping. My hands were shaking, but I held onto it tight, telling myself to stay calm. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. Then I heard it again. The steps were slower this time, and they weren't alone. There was a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the mud. My stomach churned. Scout pressed against me, his growl turning into short, panicked barks. The sounds came closer, right outside the tent. I could hear it breathing now, deep and heavy, like someone struggling to catch their breath. I held the knife so tight my hand hurt. The thing outside the tent stopped moving. For a moment, all I could hear was the rain and that awful breathing, just inches away. My mind raced with what to do, but I stayed frozen. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just waited. And then, just as suddenly, it moved again. The dragging sound and the footsteps slowly faded, deeper into the forest. But I didn't relax. I stayed sitting there, holding Scout close, listening to the rain for what felt like hours. Finally, when I couldn't take it anymore, I unzipped the tent. Outside, the rain had turned the ground to thick mud. I saw the tracks immediately. Bare human footprints, clear as day, mixed with deep, long grooves in the mud like something had been dragged. The tracks led into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I threw everything into my bag, leaving behind whatever didn't fit. I just wanted to get out of there. Scout and I hiked back down the mountain as fast as we could, slipping and stumbling in the mud. The rain didn't let up, soaking us to the bone, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting back to my car. By the time we made it to the trailhead, it was nearly dawn. I was exhausted, drenched, and covered in mud, but I didn't stop until I was inside the car with the doors locked. I didn't look back at the forest as I drove away. I still don't know what was out there that night. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't just another camper. Whatever it was close enough to touch the tent, close enough to drag something heavy through the mud. And those footprints, they were bare, no shoes, even though it was freezing outside. Sometimes, when I think about it, I wonder if it followed me down the mountain. The tracks were clear, leading away from my tent, but who's to say it didn't circle back? Who's to say it didn't wait for me to leave? I've camped a lot, but I'll never go back to that forest. Some things aren't worth finding out. I had been a sergeant major for years. I'd been through war zones, endless nights without sleep, and moments where your instincts were the only thing keeping you alive. But none of that compared to what happened on a camping trip I took last summer. I just wanted a quiet weekend in the woods, far from the city and all the memories that came with it. I picked a spot deep in the forest, far away from any trails or campsites. It was peaceful at first, just me, my gear, and the sounds of the trees around me. That first night was uneventful. I built a small fire, set up my tent, and kept my knife close by just in case. I've learned the hard way that you can never be too careful. The next day, I spent most of my time exploring. The forest was untouched, quiet except for the sound of birds and the rustling leaves. Around midday, I found a small stream. The water was clear, and I decided to follow it for a bit, hoping it might lead to something worth seeing. That's when I spotted it. About 100 feet downstream, I saw something stuck between some rocks. As I got closer, I realized it was a large backpack. It looked like someone had dropped it while crossing the stream. I pulled it free, noticing how heavy it was. The material was soaked but still holding together. Curious, I unzipped it. Inside was a mix of camping gear, some clothes, and a small notebook. Everything looked old and worn out, like it had been sitting there for years. The style of the gear seemed outdated too. I flipped through the notebook, but most of the pages were ruined by water. Only a few phrases were still readable. Notes about the area, mentions of wildlife, and one line that made me pause. "If you find this, it's too late." My stomach tightened, and I felt an uneasiness settle over me. I looked around, realizing how quiet the forest had gotten. The stream that had been loud just moments ago now seemed muffled. I put the pack down and decided to head back to my camp. That night I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside my tent felt louder, sharper. A rustling in the bushes, a snap of a twig. Things I would usually ignore now felt like they were getting closer. I tried to tell myself it was just animals or the wind, but something about it didn't sit right. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling my camp. My heart raced as I stayed perfectly still, gripping my knife tightly. Whoever it was, they were moving with purpose, like they were studying me. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps stopped. I lay there, frozen for what felt like hours. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I forced myself to step out of the tent. Everything looked normal, nothing had been disturbed. But near the fire pit, I saw fresh boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I decided it was time to leave. As I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest felt different, like it was closing in on me. I moved fast, retracing my steps toward where I'd parked my truck. I had marked my way with small strips of cloth tied to branches, but as I walked, I noticed that some of them were missing. Someone or something had taken them. I felt panic creeping in, but I forced myself to focus. I used my compass and kept moving, determined to get out of there. After hours of walking, I finally reached the dirt road where my truck was parked. Relief washed over me as I saw it in the distance. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. Sitting on the hood of my truck was the same pack I'd found in the stream. It was wet, muddy, and unmistakable. I looked around, but the woods were empty, or at least they looked that way. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I threw my gear into the truck, started the engine, and sped down the road without looking back. Even now, I can't explain what happened. I've been trained to handle the unexpected, to stay calm in the face of danger. But this was different. I know I wasn't alone out there, and whatever or whoever was watching me wanted me to know it. I haven't gone camping since. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that notebook and the words written inside. If you find this, it's too late. And every time I do, I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. I didn't grow up going camping much, but my grandma loved being outside. She always talked about how, when she was young, the forest near her village was her favorite place to play. One summer, she decided we should go camping near her old home. A tiny, quiet village surrounded by thick trees. I wasn't too excited about it, but she seemed so happy that I didn't want to say no. The first day was peaceful. We set up the tent in a small open area close to a slow-moving river. Grandma pointed out different plants she recognized and told me what they were good for. She walked through the forest like she belonged there, even though she was older and a little slower. By the time the sun set, we had a fire going. The stars were bright, and for the first time, I thought camping might not be so bad. The next day, she wanted to take me deeper into the woods. She said there was an old path she used to walk as a kid and wanted to show me. The trail wasn't clear anymore, just patches of dirt and grass. Trees and bushes had grown over most of it, but she seemed to remember where to go. We walked for hours. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birds singing, no sound of leaves moving in the wind, just the crunch of our boots on the ground. At one point, we came across an old stone well. It was covered in moss and almost hidden by the forest. Grandma smiled when she saw it. She said it was one of her favorite places as a little girl. She started poking around the ground with a stick, mumbling something about how there used to be a path nearby. I stood there quietly, but something about the place made me feel uneasy. I kept looking over my shoulder, even though I didn't see anything. The air felt heavier the longer we stayed there, like the forest was waiting for something. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was just being silly, but when I turned back to Grandma, I saw her staring at something far off in the trees. Her face wasn't the same. She looked serious, almost scared, and her usual warmth was completely gone. She grabbed my arm without a word and started pulling me back the way we came. Her hand was strong, tighter than I thought it could be. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, but the look on her face stopped me. Her eyes were darting around, watching the trees like she was expecting something to come out of them. When we got back to the campsite, she started packing up right away. She didn't explain, and I didn't ask. I could feel how nervous she was, and it made me nervous too. I just helped her pack. We left as the sun was setting. She led us back a different way, avoiding the path we had taken earlier. As we walked, I kept glancing behind us. I didn't see anything, but it felt like someone was watching. The light disappeared quickly, and the woods around us turned dark. Every shadow looked like it was moving, and every sound made me jump. It felt like we were walking forever before we finally reached the main road back to the village. Grandma stopped when we got there. She looked back at the woods one last time, then turned to me. Her face was pale, and she looked older somehow, more tired. She didn't say much after that, and we didn't talk about it once we got back home. But I couldn't stop thinking about how she looked in the woods, like she'd seen something she wished she hadn't. A few years later, after she passed away, I found one of her old journals. In it, she'd written about the woods near her village. She talked about how much she loved them as a child, but also left warnings to herself. One line stuck with me: "The forest doesn't forget who walks too far into it." That sentence haunted me. I thought back to the way she pulled me away from the well, how scared she was, and the silence in the forest that felt wrong. I don't know what she saw that day, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I think about how quiet it got out there. I think about how, when we were leaving, I didn't just feel like we were being watched. I felt like something was following us, staying just out of sight. And sometimes, even now, I'll wake up at night and swear I can hear the sound of footsteps outside my window. Quiet, slow, and getting closer. I wanted to get away from everything. No phone, no people, just peace and quiet. So, I decided to go camping deep in the woods of West Virginia, far from anyone or anything. I packed my tent, some food, and the basics I'd need for a couple of nights. I drove my old truck as far as I could down a dirt road and then hiked a few miles until I found a spot I liked. It was quiet, far from any trails, and right next to a small creek. It seemed perfect. The first day was nice. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and spent the afternoon fishing in the creek. The air smelled fresh, like pine trees and wet dirt, and all I could hear were birds and the wind in the trees. By the time the sun went down, I was full from the fish I caught and cooked, feeling good and tired. I crawled into my tent and fell asleep quickly. I woke up in the middle of the night, and something felt wrong. At first, I thought it was just the usual noises of the forest, but then I realized there were no noises at all. No crickets, no wind, just silence. I laid there trying to listen for anything when I heard it, a soft crunch like someone stepping on dried leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. Shining the light around, I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows. I told myself it had to be a deer or some other animal and went back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every small noise outside made my heart race, and I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I looked around the campsite, but everything seemed normal. Still, I couldn't relax. I decided to go for a hike to distract myself. As I walked, I started noticing odd things. A few branches broken in a way that didn't look natural. A a faint path through the brush that I hadn't seen before. And at one point, I came across a stack of rocks, neatly piled in a way that didn't seem random. I told myself it was probably from other campers or hunters who had been here before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby, watching. When I got back to camp, the sun was already setting. I quickly gathered more firewood and made sure everything was in order. That night, I sat by the fire, staring at the flames and trying to enjoy the quiet. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Every crack of a twig, every shift in the wind, made me jump. It was close to 2 a.m. when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were much closer, just outside the ring of firelight. I froze, gripping the hatchet I'd brought with me. The steps stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard something worse. Slow, heavy breathing. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The breathing stopped, and the forest was silent again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there with the hatchet in my hand, waiting for morning. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up as quickly as I could and started hiking back to my truck. I didn't care about leaving behind anything that didn't fit in my bag. I just wanted to get out of there. About halfway back, I stopped dead in my tracks. In the mud on the trail were footprints, human footprints, barefoot. They were fresh and heading in the same direction I was going. I started walking faster, almost running, my heart pounding with every step. When I finally got back to my truck, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the driver's side door. It was wide open. My glove box was open, and all the papers and stuff inside were scattered across the seats. Nothing was missing, but someone had been inside. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away at a gas station. Even now, I can't stop thinking about it. Whoever was out there knew exactly where I was. They had been close enough to watch me, close enough to get into my truck. But what really keeps me awake at night is this. As I was driving away, I looked in my rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the trees, just where the forest met the road, was a figure. They didn't move. They just stood there watching me leave. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will.